Hey, Skull Button Interactive, Oliver here. Surprise, surprise, I'm actually making more than one of these videos. I'm making a second devlog. Incredible. I mentioned in the last video that I wanted to talk about the select component, so I've got this fancy little graphic. I've prepared another slideshow because I find that helps me organize my thoughts. So I am going to get into the select component. I've been building it out in Unity, but there's a lot of things that I want to talk about. I think in the last video I mentioned some of the goals I had for it, like a use case specifically around themes and selecting themes inside of the fictional operating system. But I want to take a step back and talk a bit about the design principles, specifically this concept of dumb components, quote unquote, which I find very interesting and I realized might be fun to talk about. So essentially what this video is going to be, I'm going to talk about component design and kind of how I approach architecting reusable UI components, or widgets as they're sometimes called. We're going to talk about that, then I'm going to show you some of the mock-ups that I made for the select component, and then I'm going to jump into Unity and show you what I've got, because I'd say I'm about 70% of the way, rough estimate. It might blow up a little bit, but I'm about 70% of the way done getting that select component to a place where I'm happy with it. So, okay, preamble over, let's jump into my little presentation on what I call, and I stole this from a coworker of mine, the idea of dumb components. I don't know if this is a common thing or if there's an actual term for this. I'm sure there's a technical word, but let's just jump into examples. So this is a button. You might have heard of them. You might have clicked on one. Maybe you've clicked on several. I don't know. Obviously, buttons are probably the most basic form of reusable component. And by the way, I'm going to be using words like component, UI element, widget interchangeably. I just kind of pick whichever one I feel like. So, but what I mean is a reusable piece of user interface. And it is important to design those in a way that makes sense, even with something as simple as a button. You know, it's not as complex as a select component, but we're going to get into that. But it makes for a really basic example. So when you're designing a button, obviously there's a couple things that go into it, like how big is it, what text is on it, and what happens when you click it. That's kind of everything to it, if I'm being honest, but it's still important to design it properly. So with this OK button, for instance, there's a good way to design it, and there's a bad way to design it from like a software engineering perspective. So, and bear with me, because ignore this if you don't understand what this means or why it's funny. It's not funny. That's the bit. Anyways, focus right here. This is our OK button. So this is our bad example. That's what this means. This is our bad example. We're going to make an OK button that is terrible. So if we wanted to make a really bad button, we would go into our game engine and we'd go, okay, I need a button, and it needs to say OK on it, and it needs to do a specific thing when I click on it. And the bad way to approach it would be to essentially hard code everything and make the button very specific to the context in which it exists. That's kind of the main crux of this, is a quote-unquote smart component, or a smart button in this case, is a component that is aware of the context it exists in. It is very specifically suited to that case. It is smart. It is laser focused on doing one thing. And that is bad because what if we want to slightly change that? What if we want to configure it? It's not very flexible, right? So the worst way we could approach making this OK button is to, well, for starters, we could make the text a part of the sprite. Obviously, we're in the design document, so it is just a part of the sprite. But in the actual engine, a bad way to do it would be to have this actual sprite with the letters OK be the base of the button. We would have it built for a single use case. So what this would look like is in the code that would handle the on-click for the button, it would always do one thing, for instance. So these kind of go hand in hand here, is our button only does one thing. It's an OK button. It's supposed to do one thing. It closes the pop-up window or something, And that would also be bad because you don't want your button to be aware of its context, which is the window that it's inside of. So suppose we've made a button like that. It's hyper-focused on doing one thing, and then say we want to make a button that cancels some process, and it says cancel on it. Well, now what we're going to do is we have this prefab, this reusable OK button, we called it. And now we're going to have to go make another prefab. We're going to have to make another component called cancel button. When what we should have done from the beginning is make just a generic button. So that is the next part. This is our much better button. That's what this means if you're not terminally online. This is our cool button. It can do anything. So for starters, we didn't hardcode the text. It's not a part of the sprite of the button. The text is actually passed in and can change. So if we want it to say ah, it can say ah. Maybe it'll have a default, so maybe it defaults to saying okay, and we've put that, but it's not hard-coded, There are parameters, or if you're familiar with React, like props, this is the same principle. We've got parameters that we can pass in to our button to change how it works, how it displays. In this case, it doesn't have a fixed width, so maybe we've got this as a 9 sprite, so it actually will stretch out. And in addition to that, the code isn't aware of the functionality of the button. It kind of takes a generic input, it takes a generic action that it just executes when the button is clicked. And the code of the button itself does not care about the context in which it's used. And that's why we use terms like stupid or dumb as just kind of like a shorthand for the button doesn't care how it's used. It's unaware. It does not care about its own context. It's a dumb component. And that's a good thing. So this is the part of my design document for the select component. And if you've been paying attention, you can kind of see how the idea of dumb components is extremely good when it comes to something as complex as a select. Because if you have something where there are a ton of items being populated in this menu, and suppose you want different things to happen when you select those items, we're not always going to be working with like theme selection like we are here. It really does benefit you in the long run to make sure that the component itself is unaware of its context. So in everything that we're going to be looking at today, I am tackling the idea of a theme selection dropdown. These here in the mockup are the names of the themes. You'll see that in the engine in a moment. You'll see a lot of these pop up again later. But I might want a dropdown that allows me to select from a set of cursors. That's another thing that I've been messing with the idea of. Maybe you want, I don't know, you could do anything. That's the benefit of implementing this in a generic, quote unquote, dumb way, because that's ironically the smart way to design your UI widgets. Let's talk about the design. So changing gears a little bit here. This is the mock-up for the select component that I made to begin with, and I've been working off of this while building it out in the engine. So going left to right here, we've got a blur state. This is what it looks like when it is collapsed. Little things like when you click on this button, it actually flips the sprite here, and it flips the on-click sprite as well, because remember, you can press on these buttons and they look different when they're clicked. So it flips the direction of that arrow there, and it changes this background from white to gray. We've got a scroll bar here, which I have not fully implemented yet, but you can see you can click up and down to move around the items. One thing that I have already implemented, which was part of this design, is the idea of using the active and inactive states from the actual theme. So you'll recall window themes from the previous video. I wanted to use that here, along with the color of the text, for when you're hovering over an option in the menu. I call them entries in the actual code for consistency. So when you're mouse hovering over an entry, it will highlight it as the quote-unquote active theme, and when you click down, it will use the inactive theme. And I mentioned blur state. Blur, if you're not familiar, essentially means it's like unfocused. It's not the currently used element. I considered when you click, it goes into a focus state. So in this example, we're switching themes, so it's using the active theme of the deep sea theme. I don't know if I'm actually going to do this, but I was just kind of playing around with the idea. So I don't have to implement everything from here. This is just kind of my guiding light when I go into the actual engine. So onto some more complexities. The scroll bar is, as I mentioned, something that I haven't fully tackled yet, but I've thought through a lot of it. I don't want to use Unity's built-in scroll bar, which is going to set off some alarms for some people who've used Unity, but look, it's bad, and it's also more fun to implement it myself. But if you're implementing your own scroll bar, you run into these interesting things like how do you populate this list right here? And how many items are you displaying here? Because I want that to be configurable. So for instance, with this one, there's a display count of 5, but I'm populating it with 6 entries. And so for instance, going from left to right here, this is as if you are looking at this menu and you've just clicked this down button here, or you've dragged the scroll bar down one tick. So you can see like the bubblegum entry, which as you know is the pink theme, moves up one. So we need to change that offset right there in what's being populated. And then we also need to update this scroll bar here. And there's, you know, you can see how this would blow up because obviously this little tab in the scroll bar here, I don't know what you would actually call it. I've been calling it a tab. This needs to be able to scale. It's not going to work properly because I'm an A sprite, but it might be, you know, half a unit. It might be 1 unit. In this case, it's 2. So that needs to be a scalable sprite. For instance, there's little things like if this menu can display 5 options, we don't want that to be hard-coded because this is a dumb component. It's a configurable component. Maybe it displays 10. And hey, guess what? Sometimes you don't have a scroll bar because scroll bars only make sense at a certain number of options because, you know, these buttons have to be a certain height. And they don't make sense if, for instance, your display count is 5 and you've only got 5 options. Well, there's nothing to scroll through. It's just going to, you know, this tab is going to fill up the entire scroll bar, at which point you don't need it. So we've got cases for that as well. So I want the scroll bar to be optional. There's some logic there. And in addition to that, I wanted everything to scale. So obviously the vertical height is kind of set for this section, but for the actual drop-down menu part of the select, it's going to depend on some additional logic, but the width can be configurable. That can change as long as you make sure that the text that's going into these entries is, you know, not too long. I'm not actually going to enforce that because it's kind of difficult to figure out the exact pixel width of text. So hopefully that summarizes kind of what I was talking about at the end of the previous video of just like there's a lot to consider. So I'd already put this together by that last video, but I hadn't started really implementing a lot of this yet. So I'll jump into the engine in a second here and we'll look at what I've actually got. I think it's pretty cool because I've already hooked it up to the theme selection. Okay, now we are in Unity and we are looking at an instance of my select prefab. So for anybody who isn't aware, because I want this to be kind of sort of understandable to non-technical folks or folks who don't use game engines, a prefab is just a reusable object in Unity, essentially. In my case, that kind of corresponds to widget component discussion. It's a bit analogous. So we are currently in the settings window prefab, and the settings window contains a select, which I have named theme select. So going back to that idea of configurable components, dumb components, this is a select which can exist in any context, but this one specifically is a theme select. So the way it works is the settings window itself configures what gets populated in this select widget. It also controls the on-click behavior. So whenever an entry is selected in that, it's actually passed into the select. So the theme switching that we're going to see in a second here is actually handled by the settings window. So again, the select component itself is not aware of the context, but this particular instance of the select component is given all of the names of the window themes, and when each one is clicked, it calls a callback, which tells the settings window, hey, this guy just selected the sunflower seed theme, so you should apply that to everything. But just going into kind of how this is built out, going from our design to actually in the engine, you can see it looks pretty authentic to the mock-up, so I'm quite happy with that. But we get some additional functionality here because, it is the actual thing now. So the select itself, which I've got selected here, you can see is just this, non-expandable menu. So what happens is we've got this panel. You can see the blue shows you what we're actually highlighting here. What happens is when that drop-down button is clicked, it toggles this menu here, but everything scales with the select itself because the width, I wanted it to be configurable. And you can see that button on the right, the menu button, is tacked onto the right. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm using Unity's UI system to make sure everything scales with the correct elements that it's a child of, and it's anchored to the correct part as well. So that also goes for the drop-down menu as well. If that happens to scale vertically, you can see everything kind of tiles properly. It is scaled to an actual exact pixel height as well. It's currently 16 pixels per unit in my project, so that looks pretty nice. And you can see as that scales, the up and down scroll bar buttons are anchored to the correct points, and this scroll bar is actually its own panel as well. So everything's kind of broken up and anchored where it needs to go, and I'm using Unity for that. But as mentioned, I don't want to use Unity's built-in scroll bar and scroll rect functionality because I've worked with it before, and it's not very good, and it doesn't work at this scale properly. Like I've tried, I really have tried, and I know it's possible, but I want fine-grained control. And the trade-off is I have to write a lot more code. I have to write really robust code, but the benefit is I know exactly how it is going to work, and I can change it. So that's actually a fun fact. If you've played VSCS-II, my last game, there are no scroll bars in that game, you will notice. There's scroll behavior, so you can scroll when you're using like the file browser window or when you're reading a text document, but there's never a scroll bar. There's never a scroll bar in anything. I think the article view as well also has that. And that's because I couldn't get scroll bars to work. Like they just wouldn't play nice. They wouldn't like accept my sprites. And everything would just scale weird and it looked so ugly. And so I just gave up and I just said, you know what? Everybody's mouse has a scroll, has a scroll on it. Everybody can scroll. Which actually, this is such a sidebar, but it bugged me in VSCS-II having that be the case, and I just conceded at a certain point. But it bugged me because I think on those old 1984 Apple computers, the mouse just kind of had two buttons on it. Like it had a left click and a right click. It might have only even had one button, I can't remember. But I don't think it had a scroll wheel. I don't think mice at that point had evolved to have a scroll wheel because it just wasn't a thing yet. So it kind of bugged me that I needed to rely on the actual hardware that the user had to make that work. And that's reminding me now I will actually have to make sure that when you are hovering over this and use the scroll wheel, it will actually move up and down. I believe I can do that. Anyways, quick tangent. But I'm pretty happy with how this is turning out. Currently, almost everything is working. The way it works is it will populate with a bunch of entries. So there's a prefab. If I actually go down to the bottom and I go prefabs, widgets, and I go select, there's a select entry prefab. I guess I can click into these. The scaling's kind of weird. I need to fix it, but once it's in an actual canvas, there's no actual canvas here. It's just a theoretical canvas. Everything scales properly. So the pixels per unit multiplier is 16. So this looks ugly. It doesn't look like this, obviously, when it's in an actual context like that settings window. But we've got the select as a prefab, and we've got the entries as a prefab, which, wow, that's really weird. But anyways, the width scales with the container that it's in, so this doesn't really matter. And then I just populate a bunch of entries. Anyways, let's get into the actual scene here. Okay, I had to stop recording for a second to actually fix something because the items in the drop-down weren't scaling properly. I'm going to open up a couple of pop-up windows just because I'll be switching the theme. Then you can see what things look like when they change here. And so we've got our drop-down menu. Obviously, I can click here and it will flip that sprite. It'll change this to gray as mentioned, and it'll open up our menu. And you can see that on-hover behavior works for all of these entries. I've just set it to show everything here, so this scroll bar actually doesn't do anything. You can click on the buttons, but nothing happens. It's just, unconfigured at the moment. I'm still working on the scroll bar. But it does scale vertically with the number of options here. And the nice thing is I've got this generic on-click behavior that I've passed in, so when you select a component, it will call some behavior based on the key that was passed into that entry, and it will change things. And also, you will recall, this is the exciting part that I'm holding off on doing. You will recall that we are selecting a theme, so that theme application applies to these entries themselves. So if I click the bubblegum theme, everything changes, including that actual item, which very exciting. So I've engineered this in a way where it doesn't matter that this is specifically a theme selector, but the fact that it is shows off some of the cool stuff. So I'll show off some other themes as well, because I might as well. These are probably going to be the generic ones. I'm foreshadowing, but I have cooler ones that I have held off on adding for now. But yeah, if we want to see the deep sea theme, we've got this sort of grayish window. We've got gunmetal. Mayfly is the default theme. This is the Mayfly OS. I feel like I haven't mentioned that yet. That's a lore thing. I haven't talked about that yet. Minty Fresh, Office Guy, Ribbit, Ruby Slippers, which is just the red theme. Fun fact about this one, and all these names might change. I'm just having fun here. I've called this Ruby Slippers because this theme, Mayfly, is actually ripped roughly from Windows 3, and it was called Emerald City, which I believe is a Wizard of Oz reference. So I figured, hey, I'll throw in a reference there. Nobody will get that that's a reference to Windows 3, but it is. Fun fact. And then Sunflower Seed, which, fun fact, I'm allergic to sunflowers, so I thought that was a funny name for the yellow theme. So I love this. This makes me extremely happy. The fact that I can just change the theme and it changes like dynamically. So as you are hovering over here, as soon as you click, you don't have to refresh anything. It just already works. Da, 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 da. Yeah, very exciting. So I've effectively reached my goal here that I mentioned at the end of the last video, but there is obviously a lot still to do. I mentioned that the horizontal scaling for the entries was broken in between cuts there, so I need to fix that. I don't think it's scaling properly. I think I accidentally hard-coded this to be like a width of 8 units, so it needs to scale with the actual panel that it's on. So you can't see that that's broken, but trust me, it is broken. Hooray. And then the scroll bar obviously doesn't work, so it'll be pretty easy for these buttons because I'll essentially just have to offset what's being populated into list. Currently this is set to a height of 9. If I set it to 4, it would just show 1, 2, 3, 4, and then nothing else would show. But you can't currently actually scroll. So I've just set it so it displays all the items here. It just happens to line up with the number of entries. And then the scroll bar, actually like the click and drag behavior, and then bounding it at the top there and letting it move freely and then scaling it properly and then calculating when it ticks up, like how much do you have to move the scroll bar before it displays a different set of entries, that's going to be tricky. That's going to be pretty tricky. But I don't think the logic's too crazy there. Like you can see how it follows a strict set of rules, so obviously I can do that through code. Speaking of code, maybe let's take a look at it. I might cut it out of the video, but nah, it's fine. I think I joked about it last time where I was like, oh, I'm showing how the sausage is made, but also I'm not going to show you the code because people will make fun of me. I think it's very easy to get self-conscious about like the way you've implemented things, but I'm feeling pretty good about this. But everything here is subject to change, obviously. I think this might be somewhat interesting. I don't know. Let's find out. So this is the code for the select component or the select prefab. And the pattern that I kind of follow or am aiming to follow is every object when it's set up has an initialize method that's called, and it gets a specific config passed into it. So we've got a local class here, select config, which takes everything that tells the component how it should work. So for instance, with our button before, with our dumb button, that would be passing in the text as a string, for instance. It's a bit more complex with a select because you want to pass in configs for the specific entries as well. So even though it's got a name and this generic, like when you select an make a selection callback, and then some stuff like how many entries are you displaying. We also need to pass in entry configs. So I've got the select and then the select entry itself, which follows that same pattern. And there's some weird stuff in here I'm still figuring out. A lot of like stuff to manage the theme and switching it. I don't think this is the best way to do it, but it gives me fine-grained control, so whatever. But you can see the config for each entry controls like, what's the key, which helps us determine behavior on a callback, what text is being displayed on it, and then what happens when it's clicked, which, as I mentioned, is being passed in from the select component. Another thing, which also applies to the windows, is these implement an interface called themed, which is right here. Pretty basic. You just need an apply theme method, but we can collect everything that implements this interface and change the theme globally. Still doesn't store the global theme anywhere. There's no serialization, but it can like flip the switch and change a theme. Yep, so this is the settings window, and again, this theme of dumb components. You'll notice the select, aside from the fact that it like consumes a theme, this has no idea what is actually going to display in the select component. It's all just generic. You can see all this scroll bar like skeleton code that I haven't implemented yet. But all of that configuration, what's actually showing up in the select component and the behavior when you click on things is outside of the component itself. It's in the window which contains the select. So that is showing up right here. So when we initialize this settings window, what I'm doing is this. I am grabbing the select that's contained inside of the window, and then I'm setting up a list of configurations for the entries, which pulls from the global list of window themes, and then it initializes the select. So it's just passing in those parameters. Simple as that. And interestingly here, we've got the change global theme that's being passed into the entry config as the onEntry click callback method here. So whenever an entry is clicked, it calls change global theme and it calls it with these two for the specific entry. So for instance, there'll be an entry for the bubblegum theme, or actually a better example would be Ruby slippers, right? The key is the word Ruby slippers in Pascal case. There's no space in there. And the display text is Ruby space slippers. So when the Ruby space slippers entry is clicked, it calls it with the key, which is the theme key, which is just Ruby slippers with no spaces. Well, actually, it calls it with both. but the key is what's used to select the global theme. It finds it by the key, and then it applies it globally. This will be saved somewhere in the future, as you can see. But I think this is a good pattern to follow. It might not be the best way to do things, but again, I'm a hobbyist. I don't need to do everything in the best way. But I'm happy with this. I feel like this is a good pattern to follow because once I'm done with all the scroll bar nonsense, I will be able to use this select component anywhere I want. I can expand it in the future, so maybe you want like it to show a preview of a theme when you hover over an entry. I don't know, so I can add on hover behavior and pass it in generically as well. It it could be used for anything. It's a dumb component. It's so much more flexible. It's so much more powerful. And I think I didn't follow this pattern in VSCS-II, but following it now, it takes a lot more discipline and a lot more software engineering knowledge, but it is much more flexible. It's much better in the long term. So I hope through watching this, I hope I haven't scared you off with all the code. If you're not a programmer, if you are a programmer, you're picking this apart because I know what you guys are like. I'm one of you. I'm just focus on my IDE theme instead. But I hope this was interesting in some capacity, even just discussing how software engineering applies, how it integrates with design, how you translate design into an actual implementation. That's the stuff that I get excited about as well. And also colors. I like colors changing. That's what pushed me through this. That's the reason I'm recording this like 3 or 4 days after the first video. This is so much work as well. I know it doesn't look like a ton of code, but my goodness, building things correctly is hard and takes a lot of focus. Quick note as well, I'm using JetBrains Rider as my IDE. IDE, for anybody who doesn't know, is an integrated development environment. I believe that's what it stands for. It's just a thing that you write code in. I use Gradianto Deep Ocean, but I modified it. So if you're looking for this rider theme, or if you want to apply it in IntelliJ or anything instead, go find Gradianto Deep Ocean, and then you'll have to make some modifications. I made this more green. My IDE theme has more green for things like parameters, so you can change it if you want. That's a bit of a sidebar. But anyways, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Stay warm, stay safe, etc., etc. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.